A mother of two was abducted as she went for a routine jog on November 2nd, 2016. Authorities and family members searched for her for weeks, with her husband pleading for her return, saying, "I just want her back." It felt like a miracle when she was found on Thanksgiving Day, but what came next was a story so improbable that authorities had a hard time believing it. Welcome to Without a Trace. I'm your host, Jalyn. Every file holds a mystery. Every story deserves to be heard. This is Sherri's story. Sherri Grief was born on June 11th in 1982 to Loretta and Richard Grief. Sherri had a volatile childhood during which her parents frequently fought and struggled to support Sherri and her older sister Sheila. Sherri's sister Sheila described that the two didn't have the easiest environment to grow up in, explaining that there was a lot of childhood trauma stemming from substance abuse by adults in their home. A childhood friend recalls witnessing Loretta drag Sherri down the hallway by her hair when they were having a disagreement. Because the home environment was unstable, Sheila was more of a mother to Sherri than a sister, and Sherri referred to Sheila as her sister mom. Sherri's friends described her as being crazy and wild as a youth. Her friends recounted that she used to run away, and they also stated Sherri would make up lies, particularly about being the victim of abuse, especially as a youth. When she was just 16 years old, Sherri dropped out of high school and ran away, landing in Los Angeles and then the Bay Area. There is a record of Sherri's family filing police reports about her. In December of 2003, Sherri's mother, Loretta, called 911 and reported her daughter was harming herself and blaming it on her. Loretta also called to ask for advice because Sherri was planning on moving back in with her. The police report did not specify whether Sherri had actually hurt herself. Prior to that, in October of 2000, Sherri's father, Richard, alleged that Sherri vandalized the family's home in Shasta Lake, California. Later that day, Sherri's older sister, Sheila, reported she suspected Sherri kicked in her back door while trying to break in. 3 years later, in October of 2003, Richard claimed that Sherri, who was living with them at the time, had made an unauthorized withdrawal of money from his checking account. A subsequent police report read that the money had been returned and that Sherri was opening her own credit card account. In the early 2000s, Sherri had married someone who was in the military to get medical insurance. Sherri's mother said that Sherri traveled all over the world with her first husband. However, her first husband stated he and Sherri never lived together and did not travel together, except for once when Sherri visited him in Japan. When he returned from his deployment, Sherri told him she had found someone else and wanted a divorce, which he agreed to. In 2006, Sherri reconnected with Sherri Papini, whom she had met in middle school, and the two married in October of 2009. The couple share 2 children together, a son named Tyler and a daughter named Violet. After the children were born, Sherri left her job as an account executive for AT&T and stayed home with the children while Keith worked full-time. Sherri took the children to and from school, prepared their meals and snacks, volunteered in the classroom, made costumes for various school projects, and organized the myriad of activities involved in raising young children. In 2020, when COVID-19 hit, Sherri started homeschooling the children, and when school reopened in 2021, she continued to teach the children at home part of the time. Sherri was described as a super mom and a super wife. On November 2nd, 2016, Sherri started her day off by following her usual routine. Keith kissed Sherri goodbye as he left for work around 6:50 a.m. She took the kids to daycare, cleaned up around the house, and had begun wrapping a Christmas present for her husband. Around 11 a.m., Sherri texted Keith to ask him to come home for lunch, but since he wouldn't be able to make it home, she decided to go on a run as she was training for a local 5K race. When Keith got home from work, Sherri and the children weren't home. He checked with his mother, who hadn't spoken to Sherri. Then he called the child's daycare to see if Sherri had picked them up, but the children were still there. It was then that Keith knew something was wrong. He used the Find My iPhone feature and traced Sherri's phone to their mailbox, about a mile away from their property. At the scene, Keith found Sherri's phone and earbuds off the road laying neatly in the dirt, something Keith would later recall as seeming weird. Along with Sherri's phone lay a few strands of her blonde hair. Sherri's phone was playing Michael Bublé's Everything on repeat, Sherri and Keith's wedding song. At 7:51 p.m., Keith dialed 911 to report his wife missing. Deputies conducted a walkthrough of the Papini residence and found nothing out of the ordinary. Sherri's purse and jewelry were accounted for, but Keith did not know if any unusual banking activity was occurring in Sherri's bank accounts. Over the course of several days, more than 100 volunteers helped search for his wife, while their friends and family rallied to help Keith care for the kids. Local businesses began printing out flyers for free, and missing person posters were posted around town and at a truck stop along the I-5. One local business even printed out large decals to be placed on the side of cars, asking for any information about Sherri. Search teams scoured the area where Sherri disappeared. A Facebook page titled Help Find Sherri was set up, and a GoFundMe campaign raised close to $50,000. Sherri's disappearance inspired an anonymous donor to offer $50,000 reward for her safe return, but when no one came forward, the offer was withdrawn and the reward amount was increased and offered to anyone with information, and as a result, tips began pouring into the Shasta County Sheriff's Office. On November 7th, Keith volunteered to take a polygraph test and passed. Police were able to confirm his whereabouts on the day of Sherri's disappearance and announced there was no physical evidence to suggest his involvement. A few days later, on November 10th, Keith publicly spoke out about Sherri's apparent abduction and pleaded for her return, stating, quote, "Just bring her home. Please bring her back. The sooner, the better. She is my wife, and I know everything about her. I know that my wife would never leave me and never in a million years leave our kids." In the early days of the search, there were no real viable leads. Investigators filed about 20 search warrants, looking into sex offenders, reviewing surveillance videos gathered from homes and businesses, examining bank accounts and social media profiles, and combing through mounds of cellular phone and technology data. It felt like a breakthrough in the case had finally come when investigators learned that, days prior to Sherri's disappearance, she had been texting with an unidentified male acquaintance from Michigan. On November 1st, the two discussed meeting in Redding in an attempt to meet while the man was in California. The male acquaintance was identified as Donovan Misk. Sherri and Donovan met in 2011 when he was out of town for work. The two spent the weekend together, and the pair continued to exchange flirtatious text messages throughout the years, with Sherri telling him how evil Keith was, leading investigators to believe she walked out on Keith to be with Donovan. Between November 9th and 11th, two detectives traveled to Detroit and its suburbs of New Hudson, Northville, Plymouth, and Canton to look for Sherri and Donovan. Detectives interviewed Donovan in Michigan and learned that, although he had planned to meet Sherri during his trip, he returned home without seeing her. Donovan was quickly cleared of any involvement in Sherri's disappearance. Detectives then learned about a second man that Sherri had been texting. The unidentified man told investigators that he met Sherri at a Friday Night Live youth program around 2000, and the pair dated for some time after. He claimed Sherri was attention-hungry and that she fabricated stories of being the victim of abuse from her family and then him after the couple broke up. On November 16th, the director of the Friday Night Live program spoke with detectives and said Sherri was good at creating different realities so people would see what she wanted them to see in an attempt to get attention. The investigation wasn't leading authorities any closer to finding Sherri, and tips were slowly fading out. So it felt like a miracle when police received a 911 call on Thanksgiving morning. Around 4:30 a.m. on November 24th, Sherri was spotted by a motorist on a rural road near I-5 in Yolo County, about 150 miles away from her home. She was bound with restraints and a chain around her waist that one arm was bound to, and additional bindings on the other around each ankle and wrist. The woman who called 911 after first seeing Sherri spoke in an interview saying Sherri looked panicked and frightened. She was waving a piece of fabric that looked like a shirt as if she was trying to flag someone down. It was obvious she needed help. Sherri was taken to the Woodland Hospital to be treated for the non-life-threatening injuries she suffered while in captivity. While at Woodland Hospital, Sherri underwent several physical examinations. She had been branded on her right shoulder, although the exact content of the brand was indistinguishable. Her nose was swollen, she had bruises on her face, rashes on her left arm and left upper thigh, as well as other parts of her body, ligature marks on her wrists and ankles, burns on her left forearm, and bruising on her pelvis and the fronts of both legs. Toxicology results did not show any significant trace of narcotics in Sherri's system at the time of her return, and a physical exam did not show evidence of a sexual assault. Her clothing was collected for DNA sampling, including her sweatshirt, sweatpants, socks, and underwear, and both male and female DNA was found in her underwear and sweatpants, neither of which matched her nor her husband. The FBI ran the samples through the Combined DNA Index System, otherwise known as CODIS, and found no matches. Detectives attempted to interview Sherri while she was at the Woodland Hospital and during an ambulance ride from the hospital to another facility, but she refused to speak with the detectives, stating that her abductors alluded to law enforcement being involved, so therefore she did not want to speak with law enforcement. The detectives then gave the audio recorder to Keith, who asked Sherri questions while the detectives remained in the room and rode along in the ambulance while Keith conducted the interview. Sherri stated on the day of her disappearance, she'd gone for a jog and noticed a dark-colored SUV with 2 Hispanic women inside. One woman beckoned her over, appearing to need help with something. When Sherri got closer, one woman pulled a gun on her, so Sherri left behind her phone and strands of hair as evidence before getting in the vehicle. Despite the terror of her abduction, Sherri told FBI agents that she slept most of the drive and couldn't figure out where she was taken. She told investigators that she did not remember getting out of the vehicle. The first thing she remembered was waking up in a room. She had zip ties tied around her wrists and was no longer in the clothes she had been jogging in. Sherri did not allege she was drugged, although at one point she asked if being tased would affect her memory. Investigators told her this was unlikely. During her captivity, Sherri said the 2 women mostly spoke Spanish and played constant loud music from a speaker placed outside her locked room. Despite this, she claimed anytime she made noise, her captors would come running into her room. One woman told her they were going to sell her to a cop. For reasons unknown, Sherri said after 3 weeks, the younger of the 2 abductors ordered Sherri back into the SUV and drove her to Woodland, where she was found. The Shasta County Sheriff's Office began an active investigation, and authorities were looking for a dark-colored SUV with 2 Hispanic women who were possibly armed with a handgun. A few days after Sherri was found, Keith began sharing details of Sherri's horrific abduction. On November 29th, he spoke out and described the brutal condition Sherri was in the first time he saw her, saying, quote, "My first sight was my wife in a hospital bed. Her face was covered in bruises ranging from yellow to black because of her repeated beatings. The bridge of her nose was broken, she had been branded, and I could feel the rise of the scabs under my fingers." Keith added that when he was reunited with Sherri, she weighed only 87 pounds, and her long blonde hair had been roughly chopped off. She had been thrown from a vehicle with a chain around her waist and was covered in severe burns, red rashes, and chain marks. Keith stated, quote, "Nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to see upon my arrival at the hospital, nor the details of the true hell I was about to hear. The mental prison I was in over the past 3 weeks was shattered when my questions of my wife's reality became known." On December 2nd, Keith described how Sherri's weeks in captivity have stuck with her, both physically and psychologically, stating, quote, "When the lights are off, when doors shut, when she hears certain sounds, it's something that I don't know how to deal with. And we all need somebody who can help her through that from a professional standpoint." Keith also shared how painful Sherri's disappearance had been on their 3-year-old son, Tyler. One day, Keith found Tyler standing in front of Sherri's photo with his left hand on her face. He was just staring at her with tears in his eyes. On December 5th, Keith was interviewed on Good Morning America and shared that Sherri survived her abduction by imagining that she was with Keith and their children. Inconsistencies between Sherri's recounting of the events and the evidence started presenting themselves. For example, she said she cut her foot in an altercation with one of her captors, but she had no injury to match the description. At this time, authorities attributed her foggy memory to trauma. On December 9th, a story in People aired with the sheriff saying authorities had no reason to not believe Sherri, and investigators are still looking into anyone connected to the capture, and that they are looking for a reason why. Abductions are rare in themselves, especially adult abductions. On top of this, being two women is even more unique, so there remained a number of concerns. In late October of 2017, the FBI released sketches of two women described by Sherri as her alleged abductors. In a press release, the sheriff said, quote, "It has taken time for Sherri to recover to a point to be able to provide accurate details to the sketch artist." One of the women described by Sherri was in her 20s or 30s, and the other between 40 and 50. The younger woman is described as being 5 feet 5 inches tall with a medium build and coarse, curly dark hair, thin eyebrows, and pierced ears. The second suspect is approximately 5 feet 7 inches and has straight black hair with some gray in it and thick eyebrows. In September of 2019, the DNA profile of an unknown male discovered on Sherri's clothing was submitted for familia testing, a process that searches databases for near matches that are likely from family members. On March 19, 2020, police received a breakthrough in the case when they matched the DNA on Sherri to a relative of one of her ex-boyfriends. That June, they compared the sample with DNA from a bottle of green tea found outside her ex's apartment. It was a match. On August 10, 2020, police questioned Sherri's ex-boyfriend, James Reyes. James and Sherri had known each other since they were teenagers. She contacted him out of the blue, claiming that her husband was beating and raping her, and she was trying to escape. Thinking he was helping a friend out, he drove from his residence in Southern California to Redding on November 2, 2016, to pick up Sherri, who met with him after her morning jog. She slept most of the drive south, lying across the back seat of the Dodge Challenger. In the weeks that followed, Sherri stayed in James's apartment, eating very little, cutting her own hair, and toward the end of her stay, asking him to brand her with a crafting implement purchased at Hobby Lobby. Sherri slammed her head on a bathtub and bathroom floor to inflict her injuries, contracted a rash on her arm from cleaning supplies, and fractured her own nose on a hockey stick James held up. Eventually, Sherri told James she was ready to go home, claiming to miss her 2 young children. After asking James to purchase chains and other binding tools at Ace Hardware, Sherri chained herself up and told James to get rid of his phone before asking him to drop her off on the side of the freeway. Cell phone records from both Sherri and her ex-boyfriend corroborated his retelling of events, and James's work schedule showed him off work on November 1st and 2nd, 2016, which were not his normal days off. This matches the dates he drove to Redding to pick up Sherri. After speaking with her ex-boyfriend, investigators returned to Sherri's home to question her again. She was repeatedly told that lying to federal agents was a crime, but she repeated her earlier story of being abducted by 2 Hispanic women and denied meeting up with her ex. Sherri was not arrested that day due to the lack of additional evidence. However, Keith ultimately separated from his wife soon after the investigators questioned her about the DNA evidence. Keith recalled Sherri professing her love for him, to which he replied, quote, "Just don't talk to me. I don't want to hear it. You can't stay in the house." As local and federal officers worked to build a stronger case to arrest Sherri, Keith let her come home. However, he characterized that interim period as very strange, as there was a weird tension in the house. On March 3, 2023, Sherri was arrested by the FBI, jailed in Sacramento, and accused of lying to federal agents and faking her kidnapping to spend time with her ex-boyfriend away from her husband and children. As she awaited trial, she talked to Keith about potentially taking a plea deal, noting that it would only be 6 or so months on house arrest with an ankle monitor. Not a big deal, as she put it. Sherri's nonchalant attitude proved to be a breaking point for Keith, who literally ran away from Sherri after she aggressively propositioned him for sex, telling him how she just wanted to feel love. 6 weeks after her arrest in April of 2022, Sherri pleaded guilty to 1 count of making false statements and 1 count of mail fraud as part of a plea agreement which dropped the 33 other counts of mail fraud. A few days after Sherri pleaded guilty to fraud charges, Keith filed for divorce and requested sole custody of their children. Their marriage was dissolved in May of 2023. In the September 2022 sentencing hearing, Sherri apologized and accepted full responsibility. Her attorney cited past mental health issues as contributors to her actions. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to pay over $300,000 in restitution to cover the multi-state police investigation that her hoax prompted. In March 2024, the U.S. Attorney's Office filed a writ of garnishment against Sherri, claiming that she still owed more than $300,000 in restitution plus a 10% litigation surcharge, bringing her grand total to $340,211.23. Sherri's hoax cost the California's Victims' Compensation Board more than $30,000. The fake kidnapping also cost the United States Social Security Administration more than $127,000, the Shasta County Sheriff's Office $148,866, and the FBI $2,558. The GoFundMe campaign called Find Sherri raised $49,070. On December 6, 2016, after Sherri was recovered, Keith wrote a check in the amount of $31,818.13 from the GoFundMe campaign's bank account to himself. He then signed the check, endorsed the back, and deposited it into his personal account on the same day. That same day, Keith wrote a second check in the amount of $1,160.06 from the GoFundMe bank account to Sherri. Keith signed the check as the signatory, and Sherri endorsed the check, deposited it into her own bank account on the same day. Keith used approximately $8,212 of the GoFundMe campaign to make payments toward his personal credit cards. On December 13, 2016, Sherri spent approximately $3,053 to pay off her personal credit card. The remaining amount of funds were spent on personal expenses. Sherri was released from prison in August 2023 and transferred to a residential re-entry facility in Sacramento, California. She left that home in October, 8 months early, and remains on supervised release until late 2026. As of April 2025, Sherri is permitted to see her children once a month for a 1-hour visit that is supervised by a professional agency appointed by a judge. According to a supervised visitation report from January 17, 2024, when asked what she was doing for work, Sherri replied, quote, "Well, like this place is very helpful for families, well, Mommy is working to build a foundation to help places like this more. Mommy is making a business that will be a foundation to help people." Sherri also said, quote, "Do you know what an author is? Mommy's an author now. She's writing 2 books. I work lots of hours to write chapter books. So when I tell you I'm working remotely, that means I'm at home writing chapters on my laptop." Investigators ultimately chose not to indict James. In addition to passing a polygraph test, he believed Sherri had been a friend in need asking for help, saying, quote, "It's not an abduction. She asked me to get her." Keith and their children have been traumatized by the experience following Sherri's disappearance. Keith later discovered that Sherri would soak rags of alcohol, put them in a Ziploc bag, and then tie a string around their neck onto a Ziploc bag so the fumes would make the children sick, so she could take them to a doctor. Just another example of the depths Sherri would go for attention. His current focus is moving on and doing everything he can to provide his children with as normal, healthy, and happy a life as possible. Tyler and Violet are thriving in school and participate in different activities like basketball and dance lessons. As for what he believes the motive behind Sherri's fake kidnapping was, Keith has made peace with the unknown. Thank you for listening to Without a Trace with your host, Jalen. I hope you enjoyed our deep dive into Sherri's disappearance. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please subscribe and follow the podcast on social media. Join me next week as I dive into another case.